It was a crisp Monday morning, the kind where the air feels fresh and full of possibilities. The sun was shining brightly through the glass windows of a local bank branch in the heart of the city. People were bustling about their day, some depositing checks, others withdrawing cash or simply checking balances. Among them was a man who stood out not just because of his sharp suit, but also because of the quiet confidence he carried with him. This man wasn't your average customer. He had built himself up from scratch, working hard against all odds to create one of the most successful tech companies in the country. His name doesn't matter here. What matters is that this guy had earned every bit of respect he got. But on this particular morning, things were about to take an unexpected turn. He walked into the bank like any other day, ready to handle some personal business. All he wanted to do was withdraw $50,000, a fairly routine transaction for someone at his level. After all, he wasn't just another account holder. He had been banking with this institution for years. It was his bank, the place where he trusted his money and his future. But as soon as he approached the counter and handed over his ID along with his account details, something felt off. The teller paused, glancing nervously toward her supervisor, before calling him over. That's when the manager stepped in. A middle-aged man with a clipboard and a demeanor that screamed authority. "Sir," the manager said, looking down at the papers in front of him, "we'll need additional verification before we can process this request." The man frowned slightly, caught off guard by the sudden roadblock. He'd never had issues withdrawing money before, so why now? Still, he stayed calm. Maybe it was just protocol, he thought. So without hesitation, he provided everything they asked for: extra identification, recent statements, even a letter confirming his identity. But instead of moving forward, the process dragged on. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling heavier than the last. The manager kept making excuses, throwing around phrases like account activity and security measures. His tone wasn't exactly rude, but there was an undertone of dismissal that made the situation uncomfortable. The man could feel the eyes of other customers lingering on him, curious about what was happening. As the minutes stretched longer, it became painfully clear that this wasn't about following rules. There was something deeper going on here, something rooted in bias. And the more the man thought about it, the angrier he got. How dare they treat him this way? He wasn't just any client. He was someone who had worked tirelessly to build a life for himself, someone who had achieved success despite countless obstacles. Yet here he was, standing in front of people who refused to see him as anything more than a stereotype. 7 minutes passed, though it felt like an eternity. By the end of it, the man realized two things. First, that he wouldn't be leaving the bank with his money today, and second, that he couldn't let this slide. This wasn't just about him. It was bigger than that. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel small because of the color of their skin. With a deep breath, the man straightened his posture, looked the manager squarely in the eye, and said firmly, "You've made a big mistake today, bigger than you realize." Then, without another word, he turned around and walked out of the bank, his mind racing with plans for what came next. Little did anyone inside know, those 7 minutes were about to change everything. For the bank, for its employees, and for the community watching closely from the outside. The man walked out of the bank with his head held high, but inside he was fuming. He couldn't shake off the feeling of being treated like he didn't belong, like he wasn't good enough to access his own hard-earned money. For him, this wasn't just a bad day at the bank. It was a reminder of something much bigger, something that had followed him his entire life. Growing up, he'd faced challenges that most people couldn't even imagine. His family didn't have much, just enough to get by. They lived in a neighborhood where opportunities were scarce and dreams often felt like luxuries they couldn't afford. But despite all of that, his parents worked tirelessly to give him and his siblings a shot at a better future. They taught him the value of education, hard work, and resilience, and those lessons stuck with him. From a young age, he learned how to fight for what he wanted. Whether it was standing up to bullies at school or finding creative ways to help his family make ends meet, he developed a thick skin early on. When he got older, He carried that same determination into the business world. Starting from scratch, he poured every ounce of energy into building his company. Late nights, missed meals, and countless rejections became part of his routine. But he never gave up. Slowly but surely, he turned his vision into reality. By the time he reached his late 20s, he had already achieved what many would call impossible. His tech startup wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. Investors were lining up to support him, clients were praising his work, and media outlets were calling him a rising star in the industry. Yet, no matter how successful he became, there were always reminders of the barriers he still had to face. People would sometimes look past him in meetings, assuming he was there to serve coffee instead of leading discussions. Strangers would ask if he really owned the businesses listed under his name. Even when he wore designer suits and drove luxury cars, some people still saw him as someone who didn't fit the image of success. But none of that compared to what happened at the bank that morning. This wasn't just another microaggression or awkward misunderstanding, it was blatant disrespect. It wasn't about following procedures, it was about prejudice. The manager's dismissive tone, the unnecessary delays, the way he looked down at him, all of it pointed to one thing: bias. And the worst part? It wasn't even subtle. Anyone watching could see it. As he sat in his car outside the bank, gripping the steering wheel tightly, memories of his childhood came flooding back. He thought about the times when his parents had to explain why certain doors were closed to them, no matter how qualified they were. He remembered the teachers who doubted his potential simply because of where he came from. He recalled the job interviews where employers seemed surprised that he spoke so confidently or dressed so professionally. Each memory fueled the fire, burning inside him. But anger wasn't the only emotion swirling around in his mind. There was also sadness, for himself, yes, but more importantly, for everyone else who had experienced similar treatment. He knew he wasn't alone. Countless others had walked into banks, stores, offices, and restaurants only to be met with suspicion or disdain because of the color of their skin. Some of them might not have had the resources or platform to speak out, but that didn't mean their voices mattered any less. And then suddenly clarity hit him. Sitting there in silence, he realized that this moment wasn't just about him getting his money. It was about using his position, his influence, and his story to shine a light on a problem that needed to be addressed. If he stayed quiet, nothing would change. But if he acted, maybe, just maybe, he could inspire others to do the same. With newfound resolve, he pulled out his phone and dialed his CFO. In a calm but firm voice, he instructed them to close all accounts linked to that bank immediately. "We're done with them," he said, leaving no room for negotiation. Then, without missing a beat, he made another call to the board of directors of the parent company that owned the bank. As it turned out, he wasn't just a customer, he was also a shareholder, owning a significant percentage of the company's stock. When the board members answered, he cut straight to the chase. "The branch manager who handled my transaction today is fired," he declared, effective immediately. His tone left no doubt that he meant business. He didn't yell or raise his voice, but the authority in his words was undeniable. After all, he wasn't asking for permission. He was making a demand. And given his stake in the company, they had no choice but to listen. By the time he hung up, 7 minutes had passed since he'd walked out of the bank. 7 minutes that changed everything, not just for him, but for the institution that had wronged him and the countless individuals who would hear his story. What started as a frustrating encounter at a bank counter was quickly turning into a defining moment in the fight for equality and respect. For the rest of the day, the man couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. He replayed the scene, over and over in his mind, analyzing every detail. Was it possible that the manager hadn't realized the gravity of his actions? Or was this behavior so ingrained in the system that it happened without a second thought? Either way, the outcome was clear. Something had to change. As night fell, he drafted a statement, not for himself, but for the world. He wanted people to understand that this wasn't just about one man being denied service. It was about exposing the cracks in a system that continued to marginalize and devalue entire communities, and he was ready to lead the charge. Little did he know, His decision to take a stand would spark conversations far beyond the walls of that bank. People everywhere would soon be talking about what happened, and more importantly, what came next. The man didn't waste any time. As soon as he hung up the phone with the board of directors, his mind was racing with plans. He knew that firing the branch manager wasn't enough. This wasn't just about punishing one person, it was about sending a message. A message to the bank, to its employees, and to the world that discrimination wouldn't be tolerated, especially not in an institution where people trusted their hard-earned money. He started by calling his team. His CFO was already on it, shutting down all accounts linked to the bank. But he wanted to go further. He instructed his legal advisors to draft a formal complaint, detailing everything that had happened: the dismissive tone, the unnecessary delays, the blatant bias. Every word was carefully chosen, not to attack, but to expose. He wanted the truth out there for everyone to see. Then came the next step: transparency. The man knew that if he kept this story to himself, it would lose its power. So, he decided to share it, with the media, with his followers, and with anyone who cared about fairness. He posted a short statement on social media, explaining what had happened at the bank. It wasn't emotional or exaggerated, it was straightforward and factual. He wrote about how he'd been treated, why it mattered, and what he planned to do about it. Within minutes, the post blew up. People were outraged, sharing their own stories of being mistreated because of their race or background. By the end of the day, news outlets were calling him nonstop. Reporters wanted interviews, analysts wanted commentary, and talk show hosts wanted him on their programs. At first, he hesitated. He didn't want this to become a spectacle or turn into some kind of PR stunt. But then he realized something important. This was bigger than him. If he could use his platform to amplify the voices of others who had faced similar treatment, it would be worth it. So, he agreed to speak, but on his terms. No dramatic sound bites, no theatrics, just honesty. During a live press conference held outside the bank's headquarters, he stood tall, dressed in the same suit he'd worn earlier that day. Cameras flashed, microphones jutted toward him, and reporters scribbled notes furiously as he began to speak. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice steady and calm. "It's about the countless individuals who are treated as second-class citizens despite their achievements. Today I walked into a bank where I've been a loyal customer for years. I provided all the necessary documentation, followed every rule, and yet I was denied service. Why? Because of bias. Not because of anything I did wrong, but because of assumptions made about who I am." The crowd listening to him was silent, hanging on to every word. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked visibly upset. He continued, "If I hadn't acted, who would have? Would the bank have noticed? Would they have cared? Probably not. That's why we can't stay silent when these things happen. We have to hold institutions accountable, not just for ourselves, but for future generations." His words struck a chord. People clapped, cheered, and even cried. For many, this was more than just a story about a bad experience at a bank. It was validation. Validation that their feelings of frustration, anger, and helplessness weren't imagined. They were real and they mattered, but the man didn't stop there. After the press conference, he reached out to advocacy groups and organizations working to combat racial bias in financial institutions. Together, they brainstormed ways to push for change, not just within this one bank, but across the entire industry. One idea quickly gained traction: creating a diversity training program specifically designed for banks and other financial institutions. The goal was simple: educate employees about unconscious bias, teach them how to treat all customers with respect, and hold them accountable when they failed to do so. The man also proposed setting up mentorship initiatives aimed at empowering underrepresented communities. He envisioned a program where young entrepreneurs from marginalized backgrounds could receive guidance, funding, and support to start their own businesses. "Success shouldn't depend on your zip code or the color of your skin," he told his team during a meeting. "We need to level the playing field. Meanwhile, the fallout from his actions continued to spread. Inside the bank, chaos erupted. Employees whispered nervously about what might happen next. Would layoffs follow? Would stricter policies be implemented? The branch manager who had dismissed him that morning found himself at the center of a firestorm. News of his termination leaked online, sparking debates about accountability and justice. Some defended him, arguing that he was simply following protocol. Others condemned him, saying he represented everything wrong with corporate culture. For the man, none of this was about revenge. Sure, it felt good to see the bank scramble to clean up its image, but his focus remained on the bigger picture. He wanted lasting change, not temporary fixes. And slowly but surely, signs of progress began to emerge. The bank launched an internal investigation, promising to root out discriminatory practices. Dozens of employees were reprimanded or let go for fostering a culture of exclusion. New leadership was brought in to oversee reforms, including mandatory diversity training for all staff members. Policies were rewritten to ensure transparency and fairness. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Outside the bank, the ripple effects were even greater. Other victims of bias came forward, sharing their own experiences. Social media lit up, with hashtags like Fair Finance and No More Bias, amplifying the conversation. Banks across the country took notice, scrambling to implement similar reforms to avoid scrutiny. Even lawmakers got involved, introducing legislation aimed at addressing systemic discrimination in financial services. Through it all, the man stayed, grounded. He attended meetings, gave interviews, and worked tirelessly behind the scenes to keep the momentum going. But he never lost sight of why he was doing this. It wasn't for fame or recognition. It was for the people who didn't have a voice. The single mothers trying to save for their kids' futures, the small business owners struggling to secure loans, the students working multiple jobs to pay for college. These were the people he fought for. As weeks turned into months, the man reflected on everything that had happened. He thought about that Monday morning when he walked into the bank, expecting nothing more than a routine transaction. He thought about the 7 minutes that changed everything, and he thought about the countless lives that had been touched since. Then there was still work to be done, of course. Bias didn't disappear overnight, and neither did the systems that perpetuated it. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. Hopeful that maybe, just maybe, the world was ready to listen, ready to learn, ready to change. And as he sat in his office late one night, drafting plans for the next phase of his campaign, he smiled to himself, because this wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. The story of the man who stood up to a bank that treated him unfairly quickly became the talk of the town, and then some. It wasn't just local news anymore. It had gone national. People everywhere were talking about what happened, sharing opinions, and debating the deeper issues at play. Social media lit up like never before, with hashtags like Tanchen Fair Finance and Tanch No More Bias trending for days. Everyone seemed to have something to say, whether they agreed with his actions or not. For many, this incident struck a nerve because it felt personal. Countless people shared their own stories online, stories of being turned away from banks, denied loans, or treated poorly simply because of how they looked or where they came from. A young woman posted a video recounting how she was asked invasive questions when trying to open a savings account, even though she had all the required documents. An older man wrote about how he'd been laughed at by a loan officer when he applied for funding to start a small business. Each story added fuel to the fire, showing that this wasn't an isolated case, it was part of a pattern. As more voices joined the conversation, the pressure on the bank mounted. News outlets dug deeper, uncovering past complaints against the institution. Former employees spoke out, revealing toxic workplace cultures and discriminatory practices. Customers shared screenshots of rude emails and dismissive responses they'd received from bank staff. The picture that emerged was damning. This wasn't just one bad manager making a mistake. It was a system built on bias and exclusion. The man watched all of this unfold with a mix of emotions. On one hand, he was glad that people were speaking up. For too long, these kinds of injustices had been swept under the rug, ignored or dismissed as just the way things are. Now finally there was a chance to confront them head-on. But on the other hand, he couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. Every new story reminded him of how widespread the problem really was. How many lives had been derailed because of prejudice? How much potential had been wasted? Despite the growing attention, the man stayed focused. He knew that outrage alone wouldn't fix anything. What mattered most was turning this moment into action. So he doubled down on his efforts to push for real change. He partnered with advocacy groups to draft guidelines for fair banking practices. These weren't vague suggestions. They were concrete steps banks could take to ensure everyone was treated equally. Things like transparent policies, unbiased training programs, and accountability measures for employees who violated the rules. He also worked closely with lawmakers to introduce legislation aimed at addressing systemic discrimination in financial services. This wasn't easy. Politics is messy, and getting anything done often feels like pushing a boulder uphill. But the man was determined. He attended hearings, gave testimony, and met with officials to explain why this issue mattered so much. This isn't just about fairness, he told them during one particularly heated session. It's about opportunity. When you deny someone access to financial resources, you're not just holding them back, you're holding back entire communities. His persistence paid off. Slowly but surely, progress began to happen. Banks started revising their policies, implementing stricter oversight, and rolling out diversity initiatives. Some even went above and beyond, offering grants and scholarships to underrepresented entrepreneurs. The man made sure to highlight these positive changes whenever he could, encouraging others to follow suit. He believed in celebrating wins, no matter how small, because every step forward counted. But not everyone was happy about the changes. Critics argued that the man was overreacting, that firing the branch manager was too harsh, and that the whole situation was being blown out of proportion. Some accused him of using his wealth and influence to bully the bank into submission. Others claimed that focusing on race was divisive and that everyone should be treated the same, regardless of background. 2. These critics, the man had a simple response. Equality doesn't mean ignoring differences, it means addressing them. If we pretend that bias doesn't exist, we're lying to ourselves, he said during a televised interview. The truth is, some people face barriers that others don't. And until we acknowledge that, we can't fix it. His words resonated with millions of viewers. They saw him not as a wealthy executive flexing his power, but as someone who understood their struggles and was willing to fight for them. Parents told their kids about him, teachers used his story in classrooms, and community leaders held workshops inspired by his example. The man had become more than just a symbol of resistance. He was a beacon of hope. Amidst all the noise, the man continued to lead by example. He didn't retreat into the comfort of his success. Instead, he leaned into the discomfort of activism. He traveled across the country, visiting neighborhoods affected by financial discrimination and listening to people's stories. He sat in living rooms, community centers, and church basements, hearing firsthand about the challenges families faced. Whether it was predatory lending practices, unfair credit scores, or outright refusal of service, he listened without judgment and promised to keep fighting. One evening, after a long day of meetings, he found himself sitting in a small cafe with a group of young entrepreneurs. They were bright, ambitious, and full of ideas, but they were also frustrated. "We've got the skills, the drive, and the vision," one of them said, shaking his head. "But no one takes us seriously. We knock on doors, send emails, pitch our ideas, and still nothing. It's like we're invisible." The man nodded, understanding exactly what they meant. "You're not invisible," he replied firmly. "And your dreams are valid. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Keep pushing, keep believing, and know that you're not alone. There are people out there rooting for you, including me." His words brought tears to their eyes. In that moment, they realized that this man wasn't just fighting for policy changes or corporate reforms. He was fighting for them, for their futures, their aspirations, their right to succeed without having to prove their worth over and over again. By the time he returned home late that night, exhausted but fulfilled, he reflected on everything that had happened. From the initial encounter at the bank to the global movement it sparked, it had been a whirlwind journey. But through it all, one thing remained clear. This fight wasn't about revenge or ego. It was about justice, about creating a world where everyone had a fair shot no matter who they were or where they came from. And while the road ahead was still long, the man knew he was moving in the right direction. With each step, he was chipping away at the walls of bias and building bridges of opportunity. One day, he hoped, those bridges would carry countless others to brighter futures. Until then, he vowed to keep going, for himself, for his community, and for generations to come. The changes didn't happen overnight, but they were happening. The man who stood up to the bank became a catalyst for transformation, not just within that one institution, but across the entire financial industry. It was as if his actions had cracked open a dam, releasing a flood of accountability and reform that couldn't be ignored. Banks that once operated behind closed doors now found themselves under intense public scrutiny. Customers demanded transparency, employees called for better training, and regulators pushed for stricter oversight. Inside the bank where it all began, things were chaotic. The internal investigation revealed more than anyone expected. Dozens of cases surfaced where customers had been mistreated because of their race, gender, or socioeconomic status. Some employees admitted to making assumptions based on appearance, while others confessed to following unofficial rules passed down from senior management. One teller tearfully recounted how she'd been reprimanded for approving a loan application from a young black entrepreneur, only to see her decision overturned by higher-ups who deemed the applicant too risky. The fallout was swift and severe. Employees involved in discriminatory practices were fired, demoted, or forced to undergo mandatory diversity training. New leadership was brought in to oversee reforms, including a chief diversity officer tasked with creating a more inclusive workplace culture. Policies were rewritten to eliminate loopholes and ensure fairness at every level. For example, managers were no longer allowed to delay transactions without clear justification, and all decisions regarding loans or withdrawals had to be documented and reviewed by multiple people. But the real game changer came when the bank announced its partnership with the Man's Advocacy Group. Together, they launched a nationwide initiative aimed at educating both employees and customers about bias and inclusion. Training sessions were held in every branch, featuring real-life scenarios and role-playing exercises designed to help staff recognize and address unconscious prejudice. Customer feedback forms were introduced, allowing clients to rate their experiences and report any issues directly to corporate headquarters. The goal was simple: create an environment where everyone felt respected and valued. Outside the bank, the ripple effects continued to spread. Other institutions took notice, scrambling to implement similar reforms to avoid becoming the next target of public outrage. Some banks went above and beyond, rolling out programs specifically designed to support underrepresented communities. For instance, one major lender introduced low-interest loans for minority-owned businesses, while another partnered with local nonprofits to provide free financial literacy workshops in underserved neighborhoods. Lawmakers also got involved, introducing legislation aimed at addressing systemic discrimination in financial services. Bills were drafted to require banks to publish annual reports detailing their efforts to promote diversity and inclusion. Others focused on holding institutions accountable for discriminatory practices, imposing hefty fines on those found guilty of violating anti-bias laws. The man played a key role in shaping these policies, testifying before Congress and working closely with legislators to ensure the language was strong enough to drive meaningful change. Despite the progress, not everyone was happy. Critics argued that the reforms were too extreme, claiming they would hurt profits and make banking less efficient. Some executives complained that the new policies were burdensome, forcing them to spend time and resources on unnecessary initiatives. A few even accused the man of having a personal vendetta against the financial industry, saying he was using his influence to settle old scores. To these critics, the man had a simple response: "If you think this is about me, you're missing the point. This is about fairness, about giving everyone, regardless of their background, an equal chance to succeed. If that makes you uncomfortable, maybe it's time to ask yourself why." His words struck a chord with many, especially those who had experienced bias firsthand. People rallied around him, sharing stories of how his efforts had impacted their lives. A single mother wrote about how she finally secured a mortgage after years of being turned away. A college student described how a scholarship funded by one of the new initiatives helped him pursue his dream of becoming an engineer. A retired veteran thanked him for shining a light on the struggles veterans face when trying to access financial services. The man made sure to amplify these voices whenever he could. He invited ordinary people to speak at conferences, gave them platforms to share their stories, and highlighted their achievements on social media. He believed that the best way to inspire change was to show what was possible when barriers were removed. By celebrating successes, he hoped to motivate others to keep pushing forward. But even as he celebrated victories, the man remained grounded. He knew that true equality wouldn't come easily or quickly. There would still be setbacks, challenges, and moments of doubt. Change, after all, is rarely linear. But he refused to let cynicism creep in. Instead, he chose to focus on the positives, the small wins, the growing awareness, the shifting attitudes. One day during a meeting with his team, someone asked him how he stayed so optimistic despite everything. He smiled and said, "Because I see the difference we're making. Maybe it's not perfect and maybe it's not fast enough. But look around. People are waking up. They're realizing that fairness isn't just a buzzword. It's a necessity. And once you realize that, there's no turning back." His optimism was contagious. It inspired those around him to keep fighting, even when the odds seemed stacked against them. It reminded them that progress, no matter how slow, was still progress, and it gave them hope that one day, the world might truly be a place where everyone had a fair shot at success. As months turned into years, the man's legacy grew. Textbooks featured his story as an example of how individual actions can spark widespread change. Documentaries chronicled his journey, highlighting the challenges he faced and the victories he achieved. Awards poured in, recognizing his contributions to social justice and economic empowerment. But for him, none of that mattered as much as the impact he saw in real life. Walking through neighborhoods once overlooked by banks, he saw thriving businesses owned by people of color. Attending community events, he heard laughter and pride instead of frustration and despair. Speaking with young entrepreneurs, he felt their excitement about the future, a future they believed they could shape. These were the moments that meant the most to him. Not the accolades or the headlines, but the lives changed because someone decided to stand up and say, "Enough is enough." And yet, he never stopped working. Even as others praised him for what he'd accomplished, he reminded himself and everyone else that the fight wasn't over. "We've made progress," he often said, "but we haven't crossed the finish line yet. Until every person everywhere has access to the same opportunities, our job isn't done." So he kept going, meeting with lawmakers, collaborating with activists, mentoring the next generation of leaders. Each step forward brought new challenges but also new possibilities. And through it all, he carried the same resolve that had driven him since that fateful Monday morning at the bank. Because for him, this wasn't just a mission. It was a promise. A promise to keep fighting, keep believing, and keep building a better world. Years had passed since that crisp Monday morning when a single act of defiance set off a chain reaction that would ripple across industries, communities, and generations. The man who stood up to the bank wasn't just remembered for what he did. That day, he became a symbol of resilience, courage, and the power of standing up for what's right. His story didn't fade into obscurity. Instead, it grew richer with time, evolving into a legacy that inspired countless others to follow in his footsteps. The financial world looked different now. Banks that were once bastions of exclusion and bias had transformed, some reluctantly, others enthusiastically, into institutions striving for fairness and inclusion. Policies once designed to keep people out were rewritten to bring them in. Loan applications no longer hinged on stereotypes, but were judged based on merit and potential. Employees at every level received training not only to recognize bias but also to actively combat it. And customers? They finally felt seen, heard, and respected. But the changes weren't limited to banking alone. The movement sparked by the man's actions spread far beyond the walls of financial institutions. Schools began teaching lessons about systemic inequality and the importance of diversity. Corporations reevaluated their hiring practices, ensuring they weren't overlooking talent simply because it didn't fit a preconceived mold. Entrepreneurs from marginalized communities found themselves welcomed into spaces where they'd previously been shut out. Even small businesses benefited as grants and mentorship programs opened doors that had long been closed. For the man himself, life continued to be a blend of victories and challenges. He remained deeply involved in advocacy work, traveling across the globe to speak at conferences, meet with policymakers, and connect with grassroots organizations. But he also carved out time to reflect, to think about how far he'd come and how much further there was to go. On quiet evenings, he often found himself sitting in his study, surrounded by letters and emails from people whose lives had been touched by his efforts. Some thanked him for giving them hope during their darkest moments. Others shared stories of triumph, crediting him with helping them break through barriers they thought were insurmountable. One such letter stood out to him more than most. It was from a young woman who had grown up in a neighborhood much like the one he'd called home as a child. She wrote about how she used to believe success was something reserved for other people who looked different, talked differently, or came from better backgrounds. Then she heard his story. For the first time, she realized that someone who looked like her could achieve greatness, not despite her circumstances, but because of them. Her struggles, she said, had shaped her into someone strong enough to overcome anything. Today, she ran her own nonprofit organization, dedicated to empowering girls from underserved communities. "You gave me permission to dream," she wrote, "and now I'm doing everything I can to pass that gift along." Reading those words filled him with a sense of fulfillment that no amount of money or accolades ever could. This was why he kept fighting, not for recognition, but for moments like this, moments when he saw the tangible impact of his work reflected in the lives of others. Still, he knew the fight wasn't over. While progress had been made, pockets of resistance remained. Some institutions dragged their feet, paying lip service to diversity without making real changes. Others pushed back against reforms, arguing that focusing on equity somehow diminished excellence. And then there were the everyday battles, the subtle biases, the lingering prejudices, the quiet dismissals that reminded everyone that true equality required constant vigilance. Yet, the man refused to let cynicism take root. Instead, he focused on the bright spots. He celebrated every victory, no matter how small, knowing that each one brought the world closer to the vision he held in his heart. When a young entrepreneur secured funding for their startup, he cheered. When a community center opened its doors thanks to a grant he helped secure, he smiled. And when a bank announced a new initiative aimed at closing the racial wealth gap, he nodded, satisfied that his efforts were bearing fruit. As the years went by, the man's role shifted. He transitioned from being the face of the movement to becoming a mentor and guide for the next generation of leaders. Young activists sought his advice, eager to learn from his experiences. Business owners looked to him for guidance on building inclusive workplaces. Community organizers invited him to speak at events, hoping to inspire attendees with his story. Through it all, he remained humble, always reminding people that the credit belonged not to him but to the collective effort of everyone who dared to demand better. One evening, as he prepared to deliver a keynote speech at a global summit on economic justice, he paused to gather his thoughts. Looking out at the audience, a sea of faces representing every race, gender, and background imaginable, he felt a surge of gratitude. These were the changemakers, the dreamers, the fighters. They were proof that the future was bright, even if the road ahead was still bumpy. In his speech, he spoke candidly about the journey so far. "When I walked out of that bank years ago, I didn't know what would happen next," he admitted. "All I knew was that I couldn't stay silent. Silence, I realized, is complicity, and I refused to be complicit in a system that devalued human dignity. He went on to talk about the importance of persistence. Change doesn't happen overnight, he said. It's messy, frustrating, and sometimes painful. There will be days when you feel like giving up. But remember this: every step forward matters. Every voice raised matters. Every person empowered matters. Together, we're building something bigger than ourselves. His words resonated deeply with the audience. As he stepped off the stage, dozens of people approached him, eager to shake his hand, take a photo, or simply say thank you. One young man, barely in his 20s, waited patiently at the edge of the crowd. When it was his turn, he extended his hand and said, "I just want you to know, I wouldn't be here without you." The man smiled warmly, clasping the young man's hand firmly. "Don't thank me," he replied. "Thank yourself. You're the one carrying the torch now. Just promise me one thing: don't ever let it burn out." That exchange stayed with him long after the event ended. It was a reminder that while his chapter in this story might eventually close, the narrative itself would continue. New voices would rise, new leaders would emerge, and the fight for justice would carry on. Decades later, when historians looked back on the early 21st century, they pointed to the man's actions as a turning point, a moment when society began to confront its biases and reimagine what fairness truly meant. Textbooks featured his story alongside other pivotal figures who had challenged the status quo. Documentaries explored the ripple effects of his decision to stand up to the bank, and awards ceremonies honored his contributions to creating a more equitable world. But for the man, none of that mattered as much as the lives changed along the way. He often said, "Success isn't measured by titles or trophies. It's measured by the impact you leave behind." By that measure, he had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. On his final days, surrounded by loved ones and memories of a life well lived, he reflected on everything he'd witnessed. From the anger and frustration of that Monday morning to the hope and progress that followed, he had seen humanity at its worst and its best. And as he closed his eyes for the last time, he did so with peace in his heart, knowing that the fight for fairness would endure long after he was gone. Because the truth was simple: the man hadn't just changed policies or reformed institutions. He had ignited a spark that would continue to burn brightly in the hearts of those who believed in a better world. And as long as that flame existed, the work would never truly end.